Most people think the flood happened because humanity sinned. And that's true. But it's not the full story. Scripture describes something deeper than individual wrongdoing. It describes a world where corruption had spread so completely that violence, distortion, and moral collapse became woven into the structure of society itself. And the terrifying part is that most people likely believed their world was normal while it was happening. That's what makes the flood story feel so unsettling today. Because corruption rarely announces itself clearly. It spreads gradually through normalization, repetition, and slow drift until people stop recognizing it for what it is. And once that happens, entire cultures begin reshaping themselves around what once would have disturbed them. This isn't just a story about judgment. It's a warning about how easily humanity adapts to corruption when it becomes familiar enough to feel normal, the judgment beneath the surface. For most people, the story of the flood feels simple. Humanity became wicked. God brought judgment and Noah was spared because he was righteous. But the longer you sit with the story, the more you realize something deeper is moving beneath the surface. Something that makes the flood feel far more unsettling and far more personal. I remember the first time the flood story stopped feeling distant to me. For most of my life, it existed in the category of familiar Bible stories, something ancient, something dramatic. A world filled with corruption, rain falling from the sky, an ark carrying life through judgment. It felt symbolic more than real, almost disconnected from the kind of world I wake up in every day. But eventually, something about the story began to feel heavier. Not because I suddenly doubted it happened, but because I started noticing details I had always moved past too quickly. Details that made the flood feel less like a simple response to bad behavior, and more like a confrontation with something deeply broken beneath the surface of humanity itself. If the flood was only about people doing wrong things, then the explanation stays relatively simple. Humanity sinned. God judged sin. End of story. But Scripture hints at something deeper than outward behavior alone. It describes a world where violence had filled the earth, where corruption wasn't isolated, but woven into the fabric of society itself. Not just individual acts of evil, but a condition that had spread so thoroughly that the foundations of human life were beginning to collapse inward. And that's what becomes unsettling. Because the flood narrative doesn't describe a few bad people surrounded by good ones. It describes a world that had become distorted at its core. A world where the direction of humanity itself had shifted. There is a difference between people occasionally falling into darkness and darkness becoming normal. Once something destructive becomes normalized, people stop seeing it clearly. They adapt to it, build around it, defend it. What once would have felt shocking slowly becomes familiar enough to ignore. And the frightening part is that this process rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels gradual, subtle, even reasonable. That's part of what makes the flood story so difficult to sit with, honestly. It forces us to confront the possibility that collapse doesn't usually begin with catastrophe. It begins with slow corruption that spreads quietly over time, until people no longer recognize how far things have drifted. And suddenly the story doesn't feel ancient anymore. It feels recognizable. Because every generation believes it sees clearly, while slowly adapting to things that once would have unsettled it. Every culture develops blind spots. Every society learns how to normalize what benefits it, even when that normalization slowly reshapes what people consider good, acceptable, or true. That's why the flood account carries so much weight. It isn't just about punishment. It's about exposure. Exposure of what humanity becomes when corruption is allowed to spread unchecked, long enough to redefine the environment people live in. Exposure of what happens when violence, pride, and moral distortion stop feeling dangerous because they have become familiar. And maybe that's the deeper tension hidden inside the story. Because the flood forces a question that reaches far beyond Noah's generation. How far can humanity drift before it no longer recognizes what it has become? That question presses differently once you really allow yourself to sit with it. Because it means the story isn't just about what happened then. It becomes a mirror that quietly turns toward every generation that follows. A warning not simply about judgment, but about the danger of becoming so immersed in corruption that people lose the ability to see it clearly anymore. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. Not that humanity was judged, but that most people likely believed their world was normal, right up until the moment the rain began to fall. Corruption that reaches beyond behavior. There are moments in Scripture where the surface explanation is true but incomplete. The flood is one of those moments. Yes, humanity had become sinful. Yes, violence had spread across the earth. But the deeper you look, the more you realize the story is pointing toward something larger than individual wrongdoing alone. Something had happened to the condition of the world itself. I used to read the flood story as if it were simply about moral failure. Humanity became wicked. God responded with judgment, and Noah survived because he was righteous. That framework felt straightforward enough to understand. But over time, the simplicity of that explanation started to feel insufficient. Because Scripture describes more than bad behavior. It describes corruption that had spread into the structure of life itself. The language used in Genesis carries a sense of contamination, distortion and violence that had become deeply embedded within human society. It was something pervasive, something reshaping the entire environment people were living in. And that changes the way the flood must be understood. Because there's a difference between sin existing within the world and corruption beginning to define the world. A society can survive individual acts of evil. People can still recognize truth, preserve order, and resist destructive patterns. But when corruption becomes foundational, when it starts influencing how people think, build, desire, and live, something deeper begins to unravel. The flood narrative presents exactly that kind of unraveling. Violence wasn't just happening occasionally, it had filled the earth. Human imagination itself had become bent toward destruction continuously, and when Scripture describes that condition, it paints the picture of a humanity no longer drifting occasionally into darkness, but moving toward it collectively. That's a terrifying image. Not because it feels impossible, but because it feels familiar. Every generation tends to believe corruption is obvious. People assume they would recognize it clearly. If society were truly collapsing morally or spiritually. But history repeatedly shows the opposite. Human beings adapt remarkably well to slow distortion. What once felt shocking becomes tolerated. What was tolerated becomes accepted. What is accepted eventually becomes defended. And once enough people adjust to it, the entire culture begins reshaping itself around the new normal. That's what makes the flood account so important. It reveals that judgment in Scripture is often connected not just to isolated actions, but to the cumulative direction of human civilization itself. Direction matters. Because over time, direction determines destination. That's why the story of Noah feels so different from the way many people imagine it. Noah isn't simply presented as a better person among bad people. He becomes a picture of someone moving against the current, of an entire world whose direction had become corrupted. And moving against the direction of an entire culture is never easy, especially when corruption becomes ordinary enough that resisting it begins to look strange. That's where the flood story starts pressing into the present in uncomfortable ways. Because modern people often assume corruption only exists in obvious extremes. But some of the most dangerous distortions are the ones that slowly reshape perception over time. The ones that don't feel aggressive because they emerge gradually through repetition, normalization, and cultural reinforcement. And once people adapt to those distortions, they stop questioning them. That's how moral collapse deepens quietly. Not through sudden destruction, but through slow accommodation. That's why the flood account cannot simply be reduced to people sinned. Humanity has always sinned. The deeper issue was that corruption had become so integrated into human life that it was reshaping the future of humanity itself. And that introduces another layer to the story that many people overlook. The flood was not only an act of judgment, it was also an act of preservation. Preservation of what remained uncorrupted. Preservation of the possibility that humanity could still continue, without being completely consumed by the direction it was moving toward. The world before the rain. There's something haunting about the moments before catastrophe arrives. Not the disaster itself, but the stillness that comes before it. The sense that life continues normally, while something enormous is quietly approaching beneath the surface. The flood story carries that kind of tension. I used to imagine the flood beginning with fear. People screaming, running, realizing too late what was happening as the waters rose around them. And while those moments must have existed, Scripture keeps drawing attention to something else that feels even more unsettling. The world before the rain. People were still eating, building, marrying, planning, working and moving through ordinary life. Society was functioning. Markets were active. Conversations were happening. Families were growing. On the surface, civilization likely appeared stable enough to continue indefinitely. And that's what makes the symbolism of the flood so powerful. Because collapse rarely announces itself clearly while it's forming. Most people don't recognize corruption. When it becomes woven into the structure of daily life, they adapt to it slowly. What once felt excessive becomes entertainment. What once felt dangerous becomes normalized. What once would have disturbed the conscience begins fading quietly into the background until people no longer feel the weight of it anymore. That's the atmosphere Genesis describes before the flood. Not merely wicked individuals doing evil things, but an environment where corruption had become embedded into the rhythm of human civilization itself. Violence had filled the earth so completely that it shaped the culture people lived inside every single day. And environments shape people more than they realize. That's one of the deepest symbolic layers hidden inside the flood narrative. Because people tend to assume they remain untouched by the atmosphere around them. They believe they are independently thinking, independently choosing, independently resisting. But over time, environments influence perception. They shape expectations, desires, and what people gradually begin accepting as normal. And once enough people adapt to corruption, resisting it starts feeling unreasonable. That's where Noah becomes such a striking figure in the story. Not because he was perfect, but because he continued moving differently while surrounded by an environment pulling in the opposite direction. Every day he built the ark. He became a visible contradiction to the assumptions of the world around him. Imagine how absurd he must have looked. A man preparing for judgment in a society convinced nothing needed to change. A man responding to a warning nobody else believed was necessary. And perhaps most unsettling of all, people likely continued living normally while watching him build. That detail lingers in my mind more than almost anything else, because it reveals how easy it is for human beings to dismiss warnings when life still appears functional on the surface. As long as systems continue operating, people assume stability exists. As long as comfort remains intact, they assume collapse is far away. But Scripture repeatedly shows that spiritual decay often advances long before visible consequences appear. That's why the flood becomes symbolic of more than judgment alone. It becomes a picture of what happens when humanity loses sensitivity to corruption itself. When people stop recognizing the danger because they have adapted to the environment producing it. And that symbolism reaches far beyond Noah's generation. Because every society develops patterns. that eventually begin shaping how people think without them realizing it. The corruption people stop questioning. There's a dangerous moment that rarely feels dangerous while it's happening. It's the moment when something unhealthy stops feeling unusual and starts feeling normal. That's how most corruption spreads. Not through shock, but through familiarity. I think that's why the flood story feels heavier the older I get. Not because the world today looks exactly like Noah's generation, but because I've started realizing how easily human beings adapt to environments that slowly reshape them. And the frightening part is that most people don't notice it happening while they're inside it. That's true spiritually, emotionally, culturally, and personally. At first, certain things stand out clearly. Something feels wrong, distorted, unhealthy. The conscience reacts naturally because the contrast is still visible. But over time, repeated exposure changes the way people perceive what they're surrounded by. What once felt unsettling begins to feel ordinary. And once something feels ordinary long enough, people stop questioning it. That's where the flood narrative suddenly stops feeling distant from modern life. Because the deeper warning inside the story is not simply about extreme evil. It's about humanity's ability to normalize corruption, gradually enough that it no longer appears corrupt at all. That process happens everywhere. It happens in cultures, in families, in relationships, even inside individual hearts. Small compromises become habits. Habits become patterns. Patterns become identity. And eventually people begin defending the very things they once would have resisted. That transformation rarely happens dramatically. It happens quietly, one step at a time. That's what makes discernment so important. Because discernment is not just the ability to recognize obvious evil. It's the ability to notice slow drift before it becomes complete distortion. It's the willingness to question what feels normal, if normal itself has already been shaped by unhealthy influences. And that requires honesty. The kind of honesty most people naturally resist because it forces uncomfortable reflection. It asks whether the environment around us is shaping us more than we realize. It asks whether constant exposure to certain values, ideas, desires, and behaviors is quietly reshaping how we think without us recognizing it. That question matters more than most people realize. Because environments don't merely surround people, they form them. The flood narrative shows what happens when corruption becomes embedded deeply enough into society that people stop resisting it collectively. And while modern people often imagine they would clearly recognize moral collapse if it were happening around them, history repeatedly suggests otherwise. Most societies normalize their distortions long before they collapse beneath them. That's why the story of Noah matters practically. Noah becomes a picture of someone willing to live differently, while surrounded by a world moving in another direction. Not perfectly, not fearfully, but consciously, intentionally. A person refusing to let the surrounding atmosphere completely determine his direction. That kind of resistance is exhausting sometimes, because it means remaining aware when everyone else becomes comfortable. It means questioning things people no longer question. It means protecting sensitivity to truth in environments constantly trying to reshape it. And over time, people who resist collective drift often begin looking strange to those adapting comfortably around them. That's exactly what likely happened to Noah. Every day he continued building the ark. He embodied contradiction, a visible reminder that another direction was possible. Even while society continued convincing itself everything was fine. And maybe that's one of the deepest practical lessons hidden inside the flood account. Not simply that corruption exists, but that people slowly become unable to recognize it when they stop examining what is shaping them. That realization changes the focus entirely. Because now the question is no longer just whether the world around us is drifting, The deeper question becomes whether we are drifting with it without noticing. That's uncomfortable to ask honestly, but it's necessary. Because the most dangerous corruption is often the kind people adapt to so completely that they stop seeing it clearly anymore. And once that happens, the environment begins shaping direction long before consequences ever become visible on the surface. That's why awareness matters. Not fear, not paranoia, but awareness strong enough to notice what is quietly shaping the way we think, live, desire, and define what feels normal. Because whatever people stop questioning eventually begins shaping them, before the rain begins again. There are stories in Scripture that feel finished once they end. The flood is not one of them. Its waters recede. The ark rests and humanity begins again. But the deeper warning inside the story continues moving forward, long after Noah steps back onto dry ground. That's what makes it so difficult to ignore. I think most people imagine judgment as something sudden, a moment that arrives without warning, interrupting ordinary life from the outside. But the flood story reveals something far more unsettling than sudden catastrophe. It reveals how long corruption can spread quietly, before people finally recognize what it has become. That changes the emotional weight of the story entirely. Because by the time the rain began falling, the deeper collapse had already happened. Humanity had adapted to an environment shaped by violence, corruption, and distortion long enough that most people no longer recognized the danger surrounding them. What should have felt alarming had become familiar. What should have been resisted had become integrated into normal life. And that's the part that lingers. Not the storm itself, but the blindness before it. The realization that entire societies can drift gradually enough, that most people continue believing everything is stable, while foundations are already weakening underneath them. Scripture presents that pattern repeatedly, not just in Noah's generation but throughout human history. Corruption rarely feels catastrophic while it is spreading. It feels practical, convenient, beneficial, sometimes even compassionate. That's why discernment matters so deeply, because discernment is not simply recognizing obvious darkness. It's recognizing slow drift while it still appears harmless. It's noticing what repeated exposure is normalizing inside us, before it reshapes how we think completely. And that requires something difficult in every generation: the willingness to remain awake while the surrounding world becomes comfortable. That's what Noah represents more than anything else. Not perfection, but awareness. A man willing to respond to truth even while surrounded by people dismissing the need for change. Every piece of the ark he built became a visible act of disagreement with the direction of the world around him. And that kind of resistance always carries tension. Because once corruption becomes normalized collectively, resisting it begins making a person appear unreasonable, even extreme. Yet Scripture repeatedly shows that truth often looks strange inside environments shaped by distortion long enough. That's why the flood narrative reaches so deeply into the present. Because the question hidden inside the story is not simply whether judgment once happened. It's whether humanity still understands how corruption works now. Whether people recognize how easily repeated exposure reshapes perception. Whether they understand how environments slowly form desires, beliefs, and values until drift no longer feels like drift at all. That's the warning hidden beneath the rain. Not merely that destruction can come suddenly, but that blindness can spread gradually. And once blindness becomes widespread, people stop questioning the direction they're moving entirely. That's why the flood story ultimately becomes personal. Because eventually, the focus shifts away from ancient civilizations and toward the quieter realities shaping everyday life now. The influences people absorb constantly. The compromises repeated so often they stop feeling dangerous. The patterns quietly forming identity over time. And suddenly the question changes. Not simply how corrupt Noah's generation became, but what is shaping us right now without us noticing. That's the question most people avoid sitting with honestly, because it removes the comfort of distance. It forces reflection, examination, awareness. It asks whether we are carefully examining the atmosphere shaping our thoughts, desires, fears, and understanding of truth. And maybe that's the deepest reason the flood story still matters. Not because it exists merely as a warning about judgment, but because it exposes humanity's tendency to normalize corruption slowly. Enough that people stop seeing it clearly while it's happening. That's why awareness matters so much. Not fearful obsession, not isolation from the world, but a willingness to remain spiritually awake enough to recognize what is shaping direction before drift becomes collapse. Because by the time the rain began falling in Noah's generation, the deeper danger had already been present for years. Most people just never realized how far things had drifted until it was too late.